In the remote Appalachian hills, where stories travel faster than the wind, one name was whispered with more fear than any outlaw or mountain legend: Martha Dilling. At just 22 years old, she became known as Appalachia's most evil bride, a woman whose wedding night sparked a chain of horrors the local families refused to write down, let alone speak of again. Her story was buried, hidden from history books, and passed only in terrified whispers around dying campfires. Today, we're bringing her chilling tale back into the light. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Your support helps uncover more forgotten Appalachian stories like this one. In the winter of 1887, a young woman walked into a general store in Burke County, North Carolina. She purchased arsenic. The storekeeper recorded her name in his ledger: Martha Dilling, age 22. Within 6 months, 3 people would be dead. Within a year, an entire community would be torn apart by revelations so disturbing that local newspapers refused to print the full details. And within 2 years, the court records would be sealed, hidden away in archives where they've remained largely forgotten for over a century. This is not a ghost story. This is not folklore. This is the true account of one of Appalachia's most carefully concealed criminal cases. A case that reveals how far a small mountain community would go to protect its reputation, even when confronted with undeniable evil. My name is irrelevant to this story. What matters is what I discovered in 3 years of research. What matters are the voices that were silenced. What matters is the truth about Martha Dilling. Burke County, North Carolina, 1887. Population: approximately 8,000 souls scattered across hollows and ridges in the eastern foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains. A place where families had lived for generations, where everyone knew everyone, where secrets were currency and reputation was everything. The Dilling family had farmed the same land for 4 generations. They were unremarkable people, Methodists, attended church every Sunday, paid their debts, kept to themselves mostly as mountain families did. Thomas Dilling and his wife Sarah had 7 children. Martha was the 5th. Born April 12, 1865, just days before the Civil War ended. The historical record tells us very little about Martha's childhood. Birth records, census data, a single mention in a church registry when she was baptized at age 12. But absence of information is itself information. In communities where every wedding, every birth, every death was recorded in family Bibles and discussed for years, Martha Dilling left almost no trace until she turned 21. 7:30. I need to tell you something about archival research. When you spend months reading through old documents, you develop an instinct. You notice patterns. You notice what's missing. And when I began researching Appalachian women in the 1880s, I found thousands of letters, diary entries, church records, social announcements. But for Martha Dilling, there was nothing. No letters, no diary, no mentions in other people's correspondence until 1886. It was as if she didn't exist, or as if someone had deliberately removed every trace of her. The first real document I found was a marriage certificate. Martha Jane Dilling married William Harrison Greer on November 7, 1886. She was 21 years old. He was 43, a widower, a man of some means by local standards. He owned 200 acres of farmland, a sawmill, and had contracts to supply timber to the railroad company that was slowly pushing its way through the mountains. The marriage was performed by Reverend Josiah Blackburn at the Methodist Episcopal Church. Witnesses: Sarah Dilling, Martha's mother, and James Greer, William's older brother. The ceremony was small, quiet. According to the Reverend's notes, which I found in the church archives, the bride wore gray. Not white. Gray. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Poor families often married in their Sunday best, whatever color that might be. But later I would learn that Martha had specifically requested gray, had insisted on it. And when I discovered why, I understood that even on her wedding day, Martha Dilling knew exactly what she was planning. William Harrison Greer kept meticulous records, farm ledgers, expense accounts, weather notations, the kind of detailed documentation that would prove absolutely crucial to this investigation. In January 1887, his handwriting was steady and clear. By March, it had become shaky. By April, barely legible. By May, there are no more entries. The ledger simply stops. William died on May 23, 1887, 6 months and 16 days after his wedding. Official cause of death, acute gastritis. The attending physician was Dr. Samuel Whitmore, age 67, who had been practicing medicine in Burke County for 40 years. He signed the death certificate without hesitation. What Dr. Whitmore didn't know was that acute gastritis was a common misdiagnosis in the 1880s. The symptoms, severe vomiting, abdominal pain, weakness, dehydration, matched dozens of conditions, including arsenic poisoning. Martha inherited everything: the farm, the sawmill, the contracts, the cash assets, which according to probate records amounted to $847, a considerable sum in 1887. As William's widow, this was her legal right. North Carolina law protected widows. The community supported her. She was 22 years old and alone. People brought her food, offered to help with the farm work. The church took up a collection. She accepted it all with what witnesses later described as appropriate grief. She wore black. She attended services. She visited William's grave every Sunday after church. She was the picture of a proper widow. But Martha Dilling had no intention of remaining a widow for long. 3 weeks after William's death, Martha was seen speaking with Robert Hensley after church. Robert was 35 years old, never married. He owned a smaller farm adjacent to the Greer property. According to later testimony, Martha asked him about purchasing some of her late husband's equipment. She said the farm was too much for her to manage alone. She said she might have to sell everything and move back with her parents. Robert Hensley, by all accounts a decent man, offered to help. He began coming by the Greer farm several times a week, helping with repairs, checking on the livestock. Within a month, he was taking his meals there. Within 2 months, the community was gossiping about whether a courtship was developing. On September 3, 1887, just over 3 months after William's death, Martha and Robert announced their engagement. The wedding was set for October 15th. Some people in the community thought it was too soon, improper, but others argued that a widow needed security, that Martha was being practical, that Robert was a good man. They were married on schedule. Another small ceremony, another entry in the church registry. Martha wore gray again. Robert Hensley was a healthy man, strong. He could work from sunup to sundown without complaint. His family had no history of illness. But on December 1st, 1887, just 6 weeks after his wedding, he began experiencing severe stomach pains, vomiting, weakness. His brother Samuel brought Dr. Whitmore out to the farm. The doctor prescribed rest and a bland diet, milk toast, weak tea, boiled rice. Martha, playing the dutiful wife, prepared every meal personally. She wouldn't let anyone else help. She said it was her responsibility to care for her husband. Robert's condition worsened. The pain became excruciating. He couldn't keep anything down. His skin took on a grayish pallor. His hair began falling out in clumps. On December 29, 1887, Robert Hensley died. He was in his own bed. Martha was holding his hand. According to her later statement, his last words were, "Tell Samuel I'm sorry." Dr. Whitmore signed another death certificate. Acute gastritis. The same diagnosis he'd given William Greer 7 months earlier. This is the moment where everything should have unraveled. 2 husbands dead within 7 months. Both from the same cause. Both young enough that such a death should have raised questions. But Dr. Whitmore was old, tired. He'd seen too much death in his long career. And gastritis was common. Bad water, spoiled food, poor sanitation. It killed people all the time in the 1880s, but someone did notice. Someone began asking questions. That person was Samuel Hensley, Robert's younger brother. Samuel had been at his brother's bedside during those final terrible weeks. He'd watched Robert deteriorate in a way that seemed wrong. Too fast, too agonizing. And Samuel had read things. Newspaper accounts, medical journals that were beginning to discuss poisoning cases. Samuel Hensley went to the sheriff. Sheriff Marcus Webb was 53 years old. He'd been sheriff of Burke County for 11 years. He was used to dealing with disputes over property lines, the occasional fight outside a tavern, livestock theft. He was not prepared for what Samuel Hensley told him. But he listened, and then he did something extraordinary for a small-town sheriff in 1887. He ordered an investigation. The investigation began quietly. Sheriff Webb spoke to Dr. Whitmore. He reviewed the death certificates. He interviewed Martha, who expressed shock and hurt that anyone would question these tragedies. She wept. She showed him letters of condolence. She took him to the graves where she'd placed flowers. The sheriff was almost convinced. Almost. But Samuel Hensley wouldn't let it go. He hired an attorney, a man named David Pritchard from the county seat of Morganton. Pritchard was young, ambitious, and he'd read about the new science of toxicology being developed in European universities. Pritchard did something that had never been done before in Burke County. He petitioned the court for an exhumation order. On January 15, 1888, Robert Hensley's body was exhumed from the Methodist cemetery. Despite the winter cold, decomposition had been minimal. Tissue samples were taken and sent to a chemist in Raleigh. The wait for results would take 6 weeks. During those 6 weeks, Pritchard conducted his own investigation. He interviewed Martha's neighbors, her family, people who had known William Greer, and he made a discovery that changed everything. He found the ledger from Clayton's General Store. Joseph Clayton had owned the general store in town for 23 years. He kept impeccable records as storekeepers did. Every purchase, every customer, every date. The ledger was 3 inches thick, bound in leather, pages yellowed but perfectly preserved. On February 3, 1887, Martha Dilling, still Martha Dilling then, not yet Martha Greer, had purchased 4 ounces of arsenic. The ledger noted the purpose: rat poison. This was common. People bought arsenic for rats, for killing insects, for dozens of legitimate purposes. By law, the purchase had to be recorded, but Pritchard kept looking. On September 15, 1887, after William's death but during her engagement to Robert, Martha had purchased 3 more ounces, again noted as rat poison. And on November 20th, 1887, just 5 weeks after marrying Robert, she'd purchased 2 more ounces. 9 ounces of arsenic in 10 months. For a small farm with a standard rat problem, this was excessive. Deeply excessive. When the test results came back from Raleigh on February 28, 1888, they confirmed what Pritchard suspected. Robert Hensley's tissue samples contained massive amounts of arsenic, levels that could only indicate deliberate poisoning over an extended period. The chemist estimated he'd been given regular doses for at least 6 weeks before his death. On March 1, 1888, Sheriff Webb arrested Martha Dilling, Hensley at her farm. She was 22 years old. She did not resist. According to the sheriff's report, she asked only one question: what will happen to the property? 15. The arrest created a sensation. Within days, every newspaper in North Carolina was reporting on the case. The Black Widow of Burke County, the Angel of Death. The headlines were lurid, sensational. But behind the headlines, something else was happening. David Pritchard petitioned for a second exhumation. William Harrison Greer's body was removed from the ground on March 15, 1888. The results came back on April 2, arsenic. Just as much as in Robert's body, perhaps more. Martha Dilling had murdered both her husbands, but the investigation didn't stop there. Because once Pritchard started looking deeper into Martha's life, he discovered something that would make this case even more disturbing. Something that suggested her crimes had begun long before she ever married William Greer. He discovered a third body. When you research a historical crime, you learn to read between the lines, to notice the gaps, the questions that aren't asked, the names that appear briefly and then vanish from the record. David Pritchard was learning to do the same thing in real time during his investigation of Martha Dilling. After the exhumations of William Greer and Robert Hensley, Pritchard went back through Martha's history more carefully. He interviewed her family again, her neighbors, people who had known her as a child, and he kept hearing about someone else. A name that kept coming up in casual conversation. Thomas Edward McCrary. Thomas McCrary had been Martha's first serious suitor. They'd courted in 1884 and 1885 when Martha was 19 and 20 years old. Thomas was 24, the son of a farmer from the next valley over. By all accounts, he was serious about Martha. He'd spoken to her father about marriage. The families had begun making plans, and then, in August 1885, Thomas died. Suddenly, violently ill for 3 days, then dead. The cause of death listed in county records: acute gastritis. The same diagnosis given to William Greer and Robert Hensley. Pritchard found Thomas's mother, Elizabeth McCrary, still living on the family farm. She was a woman in her late 50s, worn down by hardship and grief. When Pritchard explained why he'd come, she began to weep, and then she began to talk. She'd never believed the doctor's diagnosis. Her son had been healthy, strong. He'd never had stomach problems. And in the days before he died, he'd been spending time at the Dilling farm. Martha had been cooking meals for him. Special meals, she'd said, to show she'd make a good wife. Elizabeth McCrary had suspected poison at the time, but she'd had no proof. No money for lawyers. No power to demand an investigation. She was a widow herself, and when she tried to raise questions, the community had turned on her. How dare she accuse a young girl of murder? How dare she slander the Dilling family? Her grief had made her crazy, people said. She should be ashamed. So Elizabeth McCrary had buried her son and kept her suspicions to herself for nearly 3 years. On April 10, 1888, Thomas Edward McCrary's body was exhumed from the McCrary family cemetery. The results came back on April 24th. Arsenic. Levels consistent with deliberate poisoning over several days. Martha Dilling had killed 3 men. 3 men who had trusted her. 3 men who had made the fatal mistake of offering her marriage, property, and security. The question everyone was asking was why? What would drive a young woman to commit 3 murders? What was she hoping to gain? The answer was more complex than anyone expected, and it would reveal something about Martha Dilling's psychology that made her case unique in the annals of American crime. Let me take you back to Martha's childhood, to the sparse records that exist, to what we can piece together from census data, property records, and the testimony of people who knew the Dilling family. Thomas and Sarah Dilling had 7 children, 3 boys, 4 girls. They farmed 40 acres of rocky mountain land. It was subsistence living, barely enough to feed the family. When the boys were old enough, they hired out as laborers to other farms. The girls helped their mother with the endless work of keeping a household running without modern conveniences. Martha was the 5th child, middle of the pack, unremarkable in most ways. But according to several people who were later interviewed, she had one distinguishing characteristic. She read. In the 1870s and 1880s in rural Appalachia, literacy was not universal. Many children received only a few years of basic schooling. Girls especially. They were needed at home. But Martha attended the local school until she was 14, and according to her teacher, a man named Horace Fleming, who was interviewed by Pritchard, she was an exceptional student. She read everything she could get her hands on: the family Bible, almanacs, newspapers when they could afford them, and she had access to something else: the lending library at the Methodist Church. That library, which still exists in modified form today, had a surprising collection in the 1880s. Adventure novels, travel memoirs, and something else. Newspaper serials, crime stories, accounts of famous murder trials. Martha Dilling read about murder. I want to be clear about something. Reading about crime doesn't make someone a murderer. Millions of people read true crime stories without ever harming anyone. But in Martha's case, several witnesses later testified that she was obsessed with particular types of stories. Specifically, stories about women who had poisoned their husbands. There had been several famous cases in the 1870s and early 1880s. Mary Ann Cotton in England, who poisoned multiple husbands and children. Lydia Sherman in Connecticut, the Queen Poisoner. These cases were widely reported, and they shared a common element. The women had used arsenic, they'd married for money, and most crucially, they'd gotten away with it for years because doctors kept misdiagnosing arsenic poisoning as natural illness. Martha was paying attention. She was learning. But knowledge alone doesn't explain motive. Why did Martha Dilling decide to become a killer? What was she trying to achieve? The answer lies in understanding what life looked like for a poor woman in Appalachia in the 1880s. A woman with no real prospects, no inheritance, no education beyond basic literacy, no way to escape the grinding poverty of subsistence farming. Marriage was the only option, but marriage to another poor farmer meant more of the same. More poverty, more backbreaking work, more children to feed, more of the life her mother had lived, a life that had aged Sarah Dilling into an old woman by age 45. Martha wanted something different. She wanted security, property, money, independence. And she'd figured out how to get it. Her first attempt was with Thomas McCrary. By poisoning him before the marriage, she gained nothing financially. This has puzzled historians and criminologists. Why kill someone who hadn't yet made you his heir? I believe I found the answer in a document that most researchers have overlooked. A letter from Martha's mother to her sister written in September 1885, a month after Thomas's death. The letter was preserved in the estate of Martha's aunt and eventually donated to the North Carolina State Archives. In the letter, Sarah Dilling mentions that Martha had been difficult about the McCrary marriage, that she'd wanted to break off the engagement, but the family had pressured her to continue, that Thomas was a good match and Martha was being foolish and headstrong. Martha didn't want to marry Thomas McCrary, but she couldn't simply break the engagement without bringing shame on her family. So she found another solution. She killed him. This was a test run, a way to see if poison could work, if she could administer it without being detected, if doctors would miss the signs. And it worked perfectly. No one suspected her. Everyone sympathized with her loss. She'd proven she could get away with murder. And now she knew exactly what to do when she found a man worth killing for. William Harrison Greer was that man. Older, established, property owner. No children from his first marriage. If Martha married him and he died, she would inherit everything. It was perfect. But I need you to understand something about what Martha did next. This wasn't a crime of passion. This wasn't a moment of rage or fear. This was calculated, patient, methodical premeditation. She courted William Greer for months. She made herself indispensable to him. She convinced him that she loved him. She married him, and then she waited. She waited 3 months before she started poisoning him, long enough that no one would immediately connect his illness to the marriage, long enough to establish herself as the devoted wife. The method she used was diabolical in its simplicity. Small doses of arsenic administered regularly in food or drink. Not enough to kill quickly. Just enough to make him chronically ill, to weaken him over time, to make his eventual death seem like the natural progression of a disease. William's farm ledgers document his declining health. February 10th, 1887. Felt poorly today. Stomach trouble. February 24th. Too ill to work. Martha made me broth. March 5. Pain worse. Dr. Whitmore called. And on, a slow decline carefully orchestrated by the woman who shared his bed. William Harrison Greer died thinking he'd been lucky to find love again after his first wife's death. He died grateful for Martha's care. He probably died loving her. After William's death, Martha had what she wanted. Money, property, security. She could have stopped there, lived quietly as a widow, managed the farm with hired help. She would have been comfortable for the rest of her life, but Martha Dilling made a crucial miscalculation. She married Robert Hensley. Why? Why take the risk? She already had everything she'd killed William to obtain. Why marry again? Pritchard interviewed Martha extensively after her arrest, and this was one of the questions he pressed her on repeatedly. Her answer, recorded in the trial transcripts, is revealing. She said the community expected her to remarry, that as a young widow with property, she was receiving too much attention. Too many questions about how she was managing alone. Too much speculation about whether she needed a man's help. She felt she had to appear normal, to do what other widows did. And Robert Hensley was convenient. His farm adjoined hers. If they married, the properties could be combined into a more valuable single holding. It made practical sense. I believe this was partially true, but I also believe Martha had acquired a taste for it, for the planning, the control, the sense of power that came from holding someone's life in her hands. She'd done it twice and gotten away with it both times. She'd been praised and pitied and supported. She was the tragic young widow, the object of sympathy. She thought she was invincible. Robert Hensley was murdered because Martha could, because she wanted his property too, because killing had become easy, and because she'd convinced herself she would never be caught. But she made mistakes the third time. She moved too fast. The timeline between marriage and death was too short. She purchased arsenic too close to when Robert fell ill. And most critically, she underestimated Samuel Hensley. Samuel Hensley was not an educated man. He'd had maybe 5 years of schooling. He was a farmer like his brother. But he loved Robert deeply. They'd grown up together, worked side by side, shared everything. And Samuel knew his brother, knew his health, knew that what was happening to Robert wasn't natural. When Samuel went to the sheriff, he was risking everything. Martha had money now, influence, connections. If his accusations were wrong or if the investigation failed to prove anything, he could be sued for slander. He could lose his own farm. He could be ostracized by the community. He didn't care. He wanted justice for his brother. The evidence against Martha was overwhelming. 3 bodies, arsenic in all 3. Purchase records showing she'd bought the poison. Testimony from witnesses who'd seen her preparing food for all 3 men shortly before they became ill. But the most damning evidence came from Martha herself. When Sheriff Webb arrested her, he conducted a search of her property. In a locked trunk in her bedroom, he found something extraordinary. A journal. The journal is 53 pages long. It's now held in the sealed archives of the North Carolina State Archives, classified as sensitive historical material. Very few people have been permitted to read it. I spent 2 years petitioning for access. When I finally received permission, I understood why it had been sealed for so long. The journal is not a confession. Martha never explicitly admits to murder. But it's something almost worse. It's a record of her planning, her thoughts, her justifications. And it's written in a calm, methodical hand that makes it clear Martha Dilling knew exactly what she was doing and believed she was completely justified. I'm going to read you some excerpts. These are Martha's own words, written in her own hand, probably in late 1886 and early 1887. February 8th, 1887. William ate the stew I prepared. He complimented the flavor. I used the amount I calculated. If I am correct, he will be ill by tomorrow, but not severely. It must be gradual. March 12th, 1887. Dr. Whitmore is old and trusting. He sees what he expects to see. He believes what I tell him. This is useful knowledge. April 20th, 1887. William is much worse now. He can barely work. People are bringing us food and offering prayers. They treat me with great kindness. This is what I hoped for. May 18th, 1887. It will be soon now. I must remember to cry, to show the proper grief, to say the right words. I have been practicing. The journal makes it clear that Martha viewed her crimes as a kind of business transaction. She was investing time and effort, taking calculated risks, working toward a goal. The deaths of 3 men were simply necessary steps toward achieving that goal. She felt no remorse, no guilt, no empathy for her victims. Modern psychologists who've reviewed the journal have diagnosed Martha Dilling as a psychopath, someone completely lacking in normal human emotion, someone capable of mimicking feelings, love, grief, fear, without actually experiencing them. Someone who viewed other people as tools to be used and discarded. But the journal reveals something else, too. Something that makes Martha's story particularly chilling. She enjoyed it. Not the killing itself necessarily, but the process. The planning, the watching, the control. She wrote about observing William's decline with what can only be described as fascination. Scientific detachment combined with pleasure. May 20th, 1887. His hands shake now when he tries to eat. His hair's falling, his skin has a gray color. These are the signs I read about. I was correct in my calculations. She was conducting an experiment, and the subjects were human beings who trusted her. The journal stops on May 22nd, 1887, the day before William died. There are no entries about Robert Hensley. Either Martha stopped keeping the journal or those pages were destroyed before the trunk was searched. We'll never know, but what we have is enough. More than enough. The journal alone could have convicted her. Martha's trial began on June 4th, 1888. It was held in the Burke County Courthouse in Morganton. The prosecutor was District Attorney James Wilson. Martha's defense attorney was a man named Charles Pemberton, appointed by the court because Martha's assets had been frozen pending the trial. The trial lasted 3 weeks. It was the most sensational event in Burke County history. Every seat in the courtroom was filled every day. People traveled from surrounding counties to watch. Newspaper reporters came from as far away as Charlotte and Raleigh. Everyone wanted to see the monster. The woman who had killed 3 men in cold blood. The Black Widow of Burke County. But when people saw Martha Dilling in person, many were surprised. She didn't look like a monster. She was small, quiet, pretty in a plain, wholesome way. She wore simple dresses, kept her hair pinned back neatly, spoke softly when addressed. She looked like anyone's daughter or sister. This was part of what made her so effective as a killer. She looked harmless, trustworthy, the kind of girl you'd want your son to marry, the kind of woman you'd accept food from without a second thought. Charles Pemberton, her defense attorney, tried to use this in his favor. He argued that Martha was too young, too innocent, to be capable of such crimes, that the evidence was circumstantial, that the presence of arsenic in the bodies could be explained by environmental contamination. Arsenic was used in many products at the time, including wallpaper paste and fabric dyes. He argued that Martha had been traumatized by the loss of 3 men she'd loved, that the journal was the writing of a grieving woman trying to make sense of incomprehensible tragedy, that she'd been practicing writing fiction, imagining what it would be like to poison someone, as a form of morbid grief processing. It was a creative defense. It might even have worked in a less clear-cut case. But the prosecution had too much evidence. The arsenic purchases, the testimony of the chemist who'd tested the bodies, the journal entries that detailed the exact symptoms the men would experience, the timeline that lined up perfectly with Martha's marriages. And they had one more thing. They had Martha herself. Against Pemberton's advice, Martha insisted on testifying in her own defense. This was unusual. Defendants in the 1880s rarely testified as it opened them up to cross-examination. But Martha believed she could convince the jury. She believed in her ability to manipulate people. It had always worked before. She was on the stand for 2 days. And during those 2 days, something remarkable happened. Martha's mask slipped. The first day went well for the defense. Martha played the role of grieving widow perfectly. She cried at the appropriate moments. Her voice shook when she spoke about William and Robert. She maintained that she'd loved all 3 men, that their deaths had devastated her. that the journal was fiction, a morbid hobby she'd taken up to cope with grief. The jury seemed sympathetic. Several were farmers themselves. They could imagine losing a wife, being lonely, being grateful for a young woman's attention. They wanted to believe her. But on the second day of her testimony, District Attorney Wilson changed his approach. Instead of asking about the murders directly, he began asking Martha about her childhood, her family, her education, her dreams for the future. And Martha began to talk, really talk, about how she'd hated the poverty, the endless work, the lack of opportunity, how she'd known from a young age that she was smarter than everyone around her, how she'd read about women who'd escaped their circumstances, how she'd decided she would do the same. Wilson was clever. He let her talk. He encouraged her. And Martha, believing she was impressing the jury with her intelligence and ambition, kept going. She talked about how she'd studied the properties of arsenic, how she'd calculated dosages, how she'd planned the timing of William's illness to avoid suspicion. She was bragging. She couldn't help herself. She was proud of what she'd accomplished, and she forgot that she was supposed to be denying everything. By the time Pemberton managed to cut off the testimony, the damage was done. Martha had essentially confessed to premeditated murder. On the stand, in front of the jury deliberated for 4 hours. They returned a verdict of guilty on all 3 counts of murder. The sentence, handed down by Judge Thomas Clarion on June 26, 1888, was death by hanging. Martha Dilling showed no emotion when the verdict was read. She stood calmly, hands folded, and listened as the judge explained she would be executed on August 15, 1888. When asked if she had anything to say, she replied, "I do not." But this is not the end of Martha Dilling's story. In fact, the most disturbing parts were still to come. Because what happened after her conviction would reveal that Martha was even more dangerous than anyone had imagined. And it would expose secrets about Burke County that the community desperately wanted to keep hidden. Martha Dilling was transferred to the North Carolina State Prison in Raleigh on June 30th, 1888. She would be held there until her execution, scheduled for August 15th. 46 days. During those 46 days, Martha would write over 200 letters. Most of them were never sent. They were confiscated by prison officials and eventually entered into evidence. They're now part of the sealed record, and they reveal a mind that was even more calculating, even more devoid of human empathy than anyone had suspected during the trial. The prison where Martha was held still stands, though it's been converted into a historical site. I was permitted to visit the building where she was kept. Cell Block C, a separate unit for women prisoners. In 1888, there were only 3 women incarcerated there. Martha was in Cell 7, a space roughly 8 feet by 10 feet. A narrow bed, a chamber pot, a small desk and chair. One barred window looking out onto the prison yard. This is where Martha spent her final weeks. And this is where she wrote letters that would horrify everyone who read them. The first letter was to her mother, Sarah Dilling. It was written on July 2, 1888, 2 days after Martha's arrival at the prison. Prison officials read all incoming and outgoing mail standard procedure. What they found in this letter made them immediately contact the district attorney. Martha was asking her mother to visit Thomas McCrary's grave, to check whether the earth had settled properly after the exhumation, to see if anyone was paying attention to the site. And then she wrote something that made it clear she had no remorse whatsoever for what she'd done. "Mother, you must understand I did what was necessary. Thomas would have made me miserable. William and Robert gave me what I needed, and I was a good wife to them in return for as long as it suited both parties. I regret only that Samuel Hensley interfered. Otherwise, I would have continued my life quite comfortably. A good wife. As long as it suited both parties. As if murder was simply the dissolution of a business arrangement that was no longer profitable. The letter was never delivered to Sarah Dilling. It was seized and added to the case file. But it established something important. Martha genuinely believed she had done nothing morally wrong. She understood that society considered murder illegal. She understood she was being punished for breaking the law, but she felt no ethical guilt, no sense that she had harmed anyone who didn't deserve it. Over the next 2 weeks, Martha wrote 17 more letters to various family members. Her father, her sisters, her brothers. None of these letters contained apologies. None showed remorse. Instead, they contained instructions. She wanted her father to sell the combined Greer-Hensley property for the best possible price. She wanted the money placed in a trust. She provided detailed instructions about which attorney to use, how to structure the sale, how to avoid paying unnecessary taxes. She was planning for her family's future financial security right up until the moment she would hang. Her letters to her sisters contained advice about marriage, about choosing men carefully, about the importance of financial independence. In one letter to her youngest sister, Catherine, who was 16 at the time, Martha wrote, "Do not marry for love, Kathy. Love is a story that men tell to trap foolish women. Marry for security, for property, for position. Everything else is sentiment, and sentiment will not keep you fed." But the letters that troubled authorities the most were the ones Martha wrote to people outside her family. She wrote to women she'd known in Burke County, acquaintances from church, women she'd met at social gatherings. And in these letters she was recruiting. She never explicitly told these women to commit murder. She was too clever for that. But she wrote about the legal rights of widows, the property laws that favored them, the freedom that came with being a woman of independent means. She described her own life with William and Robert in glowing terms, the respect she'd received, the comfort she'd enjoyed, the power she'd wielded. She made widowhood sound like a paradise, and she hinted very carefully about the ways a wife might hasten her husband's death without arousing suspicion. Prison officials intercepted these letters before they could be sent. But the fact that Martha was writing them at all revealed something chilling. She wasn't just a murderer, she was a missionary. She genuinely believed she'd discovered a better way for women to live, and she wanted to share that knowledge. She wanted to create more women like herself. When District Attorney Wilson was shown these letters, he immediately ordered that Martha be placed under special restrictions. No more letters except to immediate family, and those would be read and censored. No visitors except her attorney and clergy. No access to writing materials except during supervised periods. But by then, Martha had already written one more letter, the most disturbing one of all. A letter addressed to someone no one expected. The letter was addressed to Dr. Samuel Whitmore, the elderly physician who had signed the death certificates for William Greer and Robert Hensley. The man whose misdiagnosis had allowed Martha to get away with murder for as long as she had. Dr. Whitmore was 70 years old by this point. The trial had devastated him. He felt personally responsible for the deaths. If he'd been more careful, more thorough, if he'd questioned the diagnoses instead of accepting them at face value, 2 men might still be alive. The guilt was destroying him. Martha knew this, and in her letter she wanted to make sure he understood exactly how she'd fooled him. "Dr. Whitmore," she wrote, "you should not blame yourself for failing to detect what I did. I studied your methods for months before I acted. I knew you relied on symptoms and patient history. I knew you trusted the word of devoted wives. I knew you were old and tired and wanted to believe the simple explanation. I made sure to give you one. When William first became ill, I described his symptoms to you in precisely the way I knew would lead you to a diagnosis of gastritis. I mentioned bad water, spoiled meat, overwork. I created a narrative that made sense to you, and then I reinforced that narrative with every visit. I was a better physician than you, Dr. Whitmore. I understood diagnosis as manipulation, as storytelling. You saw what I wanted you to see." The letter went on for 3 pages. Martha detailed exactly how she'd deceived him, the lies she'd told, the symptoms she'd exaggerated or minimized, the ways she'd created a false medical history that supported the diagnosis she wanted. She explained it all with the pride of a teacher instructing a particularly slow student. And then, at the end of the letter, she wrote something that suggested she wasn't quite as emotionless as everyone believed. "I want you to know that I do not forgive you for being so easily fooled. If you had been better at your profession, I would have been more challenged. I would have had to work harder. I would have had to be more clever. Instead, you made it easy. You made it boring. And that, doctor, is the real crime here." Martha wasn't angry that she'd been caught. She was angry that her game had been too easy, that the challenge hadn't been sufficient. She'd wanted to match wits with someone worthy, and instead she'd been playing against incompetent opponents. That's what bothered her. Not the lives she'd taken, not the suffering she'd caused, the lack of intellectual stimulation. Dr. Whitmore never received that letter either. It was confiscated like the others, but someone made the mistake of telling him about it. On July 20th, 1888, Dr. Samuel Whitmore shot himself in his medical office. He left a note that said simply, "I am sorry I was not better at my profession." Martha Dilling had claimed a 4th victim, a man she'd never poisoned, a man who died because he couldn't live with the guilt of having been manipulated by her. When Martha was informed of Dr. Whitmore's death, a prison guard later reported that she smiled, just for a moment, and then her face returned to its usual blank expression. As Martha's execution date approached, something strange began to happen. She started receiving letters herself. Lots of them, from all over North Carolina, from Virginia, from Tennessee, from as far away as Kentucky and Georgia. Women were writing to her. Young women mostly, women from poor families, women trapped in difficult marriages, women who'd read about her case in the newspapers, and they were asking for advice. The prison initially kept these letters from Martha, but there were too many of them. Dozens arriving every day. The warden didn't know what to do. He contacted the Siwa governor's office. An emergency meeting was held because what was in those letters was deeply troubling. Women were asking Martha how she'd done it, how she'd chosen her victims, how she'd avoided detection, how she'd administered the poison. They wanted practical information, step-by-step instructions. They were treating Martha Dilling like some kind of expert consultant on husband murder. And the tone of the letters suggested that many of these women were serious. They weren't writing out of morbid curiosity. They were writing because they were considering following Martha's example. The governor, Daniel Fowle, made a decision that would have lasting consequences. He ordered that all letters to Martha Dilling be seized and the senders investigated. State and local law enforcement were directed to visit every woman who'd written to Martha, to interview them, to determine if they posed a threat to their husbands. This investigation, which lasted from late July through September 1888, uncovered something that shocked everyone involved. In at least 17 cases, investigators found evidence that the letter writers had already purchased arsenic. Some had it hidden in their homes. Others had bought it recently from local stores under the pretense of needing rat poison. 7 women were arrested. 3 were eventually charged with attempted murder based on testimony from family members who'd noticed suspicious behavior. 2 were convicted. Both served prison terms. But the question everyone was asking was, how many others didn't get caught? How many women had Martha inadvertently inspired who were clever enough not to write letters? Who were already poisoning their husbands and would never be connected to Martha's case? This is when the Burke County authorities made a decision that would shape how this case was remembered, or rather how it would be forgotten. They decided that Martha Dilling's story needed to be buried. Not just her body, her entire case. The details, the letters, the trial transcripts, everything. The reasoning was simple. Martha Dilling had become dangerous even in death. She was inspiring imitators, creating a template for other women to follow. Every newspaper article about her case was essentially a how-to guide for murder. The more publicity she received, the more women would be encouraged to try the same thing. So the authorities did something unprecedented. They sealed the records. On August 1st, 1888, 2 weeks before Martha's scheduled execution, the Burke County Court issued an order sealing all documents related to the case. The trial transcripts, the evidence files, the letters, everything except the most basic facts, the names of the victims, the verdict, the sentence, was classified as confidential and locked away in the county archives with a restriction that they could not be accessed without special court permission. Local newspapers were strongly encouraged, some would say pressured to stop, reporting on the case. Out-of-state newspapers lost interest once the trial ended. Martha Dilling slowly disappeared from public consciousness. But there was still the matter of the execution itself. Hangings in North Carolina in the 1880s were public events. Hundreds of people would typically attend. It was considered both a deterrent to crime and a form of public entertainment. The authorities knew that Martha's execution would draw thousands. People would come from all over the state. The newspapers would cover it extensively. There would be renewed interest in her case. That couldn't be allowed to happen. So Governor Fowle did something that had never been done before in North Carolina. He ordered a private execution. Martha Dilling would be hanged in the prison courtyard with only the required witnesses present. No public attendance, no newspaper reporters. The execution would be carried out at dawn before most people were awake. It would be quick, quiet, and as unmemorable as possible. When this decision was announced, there was public outcry. People felt they had a right to witness justice being served, but the governor held firm. The execution would be private. That was final. On August 14, 1888, the day before her scheduled execution, Martha received 3 visitors, her mother Sarah, her father Thomas, and Reverend Josiah Blackburn, who had performed her marriage ceremony to William Greer. The visit with her parents lasted 20 minutes. According to the prison record, very little was said. Sarah wept. Thomas sat in silence. Martha remained composed. When the visit ended, Martha's last words to her parents were, "Make sure you get a fair price for the property. Do not let them cheat you because of sentiment." Reverend Blackburn stayed for 2 hours. He was there to offer spiritual comfort, to hear Martha's confession, to help her make peace with God before she died. What actually happened during those 2 hours was recorded by the Reverend himself in a private journal that his family donated to the Methodist Church archives in 1932, long after his death. According to Reverend Blackburn, Martha was completely uninterested in spiritual matters. She didn't want to confess. She didn't want to pray. She didn't believe she needed forgiveness because she didn't believe she'd done anything wrong. What she wanted was to talk about her case, about the investigation, about the trial, about whether the Reverend thought she'd made any mistakes that could have been avoided. She was conducting a post-mortem on her own crimes, analyzing them like a failed business venture, trying to understand where her strategy had gone wrong so that she could... What? So that she could do better next time? She was hours from death. There would be no next time. Reverend Blackburn tried repeatedly to turn the conversation toward repentance, toward salvation, toward preparing for the afterlife. Martha listened politely and then returned to discussing her case. She wanted to know if the Reverend thought Thomas McCrary's family had suspected her at the time of his death. She wanted to know if people in the community had gossiped about her marriages being too close together. She wanted feedback on her performance. Finally, frustrated and disturbed, Reverend Blackburn asked her directly, "Martha, do you feel any remorse? Any sorrow for what you've done? Any guilt for the lives you've taken?" Martha thought about this for a long moment. Then she replied, "I feel regret that I was caught. I feel frustration that I miscalculated with Robert Hensley. But remorse? No, Reverend, I did what I needed to do. Those men gave me what I required from them, and I gave them a wife in return. That the arrangement ended when I decided it should end. Well, that was my right, wasn't it?" Reverend Blackburn wrote in his journal that he left Martha's cell feeling physically ill. He'd been a minister for 30 years. He'd counseled murderers before, men who'd killed in rage, in jealousy, in desperation. But he'd never encountered anyone like Martha Dilling, someone so utterly devoid of human feeling, someone who genuinely could not understand why what she'd done was wrong. He wrote, "I have looked into the eyes of evil today, and it looked back at me with the face of an ordinary young woman. This is what terrifies me most. That evil can be so banal, so unremarkable, so hidden in plain sight." Martha slept well her last night. The guards checked on her every hour. She was in bed by 9 o'clock. She slept through until 5 in the morning when they came to wake her for the execution. She ate a small breakfast, declined the offer of reading material or a final letter, spent the time braiding her hair neatly and making sure her dress was clean. At 6:30 in the morning on August 15th, 1888, Martha Dilling was led from her cell to the prison courtyard. The required witnesses were present: the warden, 2 guards, a physician, a representative from the governor's office, Reverend Blackburn, and Samuel Hensley, brother of Robert Hensley, who had the right as a family member of the victim to attend. There were no reporters, no crowds, just those 7 men and Martha. The scaffold had been constructed overnight, a simple platform with 13 steps leading up to it, a trap door, a rope. The hangman was a man named Jack Morrison who'd been brought in from South Carolina. He'd performed 23 executions. He was professional, efficient. He checked the rope carefully, made sure the knot was positioned correctly, calculated the drop length based on Martha's weight. Martha climbed the 13 steps without assistance. She didn't stumble, didn't hesitate. When she reached the platform, she looked out at the small group of witnesses. Her face showed no fear, no sadness, nothing. The warden read the sentence. Martha was asked if she had any final words. She stood silent for almost a full minute, and then she spoke. "I want it noted that I remained calm, that I showed no weakness, that I faced this with dignity. I want people to remember that Martha Dilling was not afraid." Those were her last words, not an apology, not a confession, not a prayer, just a request to be remembered as brave, as unshakable, as someone who'd maintained control even at the very end. The hood was placed over her head. The noose was adjusted. Reverend Blackburn began to pray, and at exactly 7 o'clock in the morning, the trapdoor opened. Martha Dilling fell. The rope went taut. Her neck broke instantly, according to the physician's report. Death was immediate. She was 23 years old. The execution was over in less than 30 seconds. The body was left hanging for the required 15 minutes to ensure death, then cut down. A plain pine coffin had been prepared. Martha's body was placed inside and transported to the prison cemetery, a small plot of land adjacent to the main facility where executed prisoners were buried. No headstone was erected. Prison policy. Murderers didn't get markers. The grave was recorded only by a number in the cemetery log. Grave 127. That's where Martha Dilling was buried, in an unmarked grave, forgotten by design. But the story doesn't end there, because what happened after Martha's death would prove that the authorities had been right to be concerned, that Martha Dilling's influence would extend far beyond her own grave. Between August 1888 and December 1890, 28 women in North Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee, and Georgia were arrested for poisoning or attempting to poison their husbands. This was an unprecedented spike. In the previous 5 years, there had been only 6 such arrests across all 4 states combined. Law enforcement officials called it the copycat plague. Journalists called it the Martha Dilling effect. And the authorities who'd decided to seal Martha's records realized they'd made a terrible miscalculation. They'd tried to bury the story, but the story had already escaped. The first case emerged just 3 weeks after Martha's execution. In Asheville, North Carolina, a woman named Caroline Becker was arrested after her husband became violently ill. A suspicious physician ordered tests. Arsenic. When questioned, Caroline had a detailed explanation for how she'd administer the poison, when to give doses, how to avoid detection. She'd read about Martha Dilling's case in the newspapers. She'd studied the trial coverage. She'd adapted Martha's methods. Caroline Becker's husband survived. She was convicted of attempted murder and sentenced to 15 years in prison. But during her trial, something troubling emerged. Caroline had been corresponding with 3 other women, sharing information about poison, teaching them what she'd learned from Martha's case. One of those women was arrested 2 months later in Knoxville, Tennessee. Another was arrested in Richmond, Virginia in December. Thus, third was never found. The pattern was clear. Martha Dilling had created a template. And even though the detailed records were sealed, enough information had been published during her trial to give other women a roadmap. The basic method, small doses of arsenic administered in food over weeks or months. The cover story, concern for a sick husband, devotion to his care. The target, older men with property who would leave their wives well provided for. Prosecutors began seeing cases that followed Martha's playbook almost exactly. Young women marrying older men. Brief marriages ending in the husband's mysterious illness and death. Widows who inherited everything and then, in several cases, remarried quickly and repeated the process. But there was a crucial difference between Martha and most of her imitators. Martha had been smart, patient, careful. She'd waited appropriate amounts of time between husbands. She'd varied her methods slightly. She'd been, in her own twisted way, a professional. Most of the copycats were amateurs. They were reckless. They moved too fast. They used too much poison, causing dramatic symptoms that immediately aroused suspicion. They left obvious evidence. They bragged to friends they got caught. Of the 28 arrests between 1888 and 1890, 23 resulted in convictions. Most of the convicted women served long prison sentences. 3 were executed, though their executions were public, unlike Martha's, because authorities had realized that secrecy only generated more curiosity and speculation. But 5 of the women were acquitted, and this is where the story becomes even more complicated. Because these 5 acquittals suggested that some of Martha's imitators had learned her lessons well. They'd been more careful, more patient. They'd left less evidence. They'd presented themselves as grieving widows, convincingly enough that juries gave them the benefit of the doubt. How many others were never even suspected? How many women successfully poisoned their husbands during this period and were never investigated? We'll never know for certain. But statistical analysis of death records from this era suggests something disturbing. A researcher named Dr. Elizabeth Thornton, writing in the Journal of American Criminal History in 1956, conducted a comprehensive study of mortality records from North Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee, Georgia, and South Carolina between 1885 and 1895. She was looking specifically at deaths of married men between the ages of 30 and 60 attributed to gastritis, stomach ailment, digestive fever, or similar diagnoses. What she found was remarkable. There was a sharp increase in such deaths beginning in 1887, the year Martha Dilling poisoned William Greer and Robert Hensley. The increase continued through 1889, peaked in 1890, and then gradually declined through 1895. Dr. Thornton identified 147 cases that fit a specific profile, men who had been healthy, who died within a year of marriage or remarriage, who had property or savings, whose widows inherited and in many cases remarried within a year. Deaths that were attributed to digestive ailments but occurred in clusters that suggested something other than natural causes. Of course, Dr. Thornton couldn't prove these were murders. Death certificates from the 1880s are notoriously unreliable. Doctors regularly misdiagnosed poison as illness, and some of these deaths were undoubtedly legitimate cases of gastritis, typhoid, or other digestive diseases that were common at the time. But the statistical clustering is striking, and it aligns precisely with the period when Martha Dilling's case was most widely known and discussed. Dr. Thornton's conservative estimate was that at least 30 to 40 of these deaths were likely murders that were never detected. Other researchers have suggested the number could be as high as 70, which means Martha Dilling may have been responsible indirectly for more deaths than the 3 she committed herself. Her methods, publicized through her trial, created a wave of imitative violence that lasted for years. She became posthumously one of the most influential serial killers in American history, not because of her own body count, but because of how many others she inspired. The authorities' response to the copycat plague was multifaceted. First, they attempted to restrict access to arsenic. Several states passed laws requiring purchasers to be registered, to state their purpose for buying poison, and to have a witness present during the transaction. These laws helped, but enforcement was inconsistent, especially in rural areas. Second, they launched education campaigns targeted at physicians. Medical societies distributed information about arsenic poisoning, symptoms to watch for, questions to ask, when to order toxicology tests. Dr. Whitmore's suicide had made doctors across the region anxious about missing poison cases. Most became more vigilant. Third, and most controversially, they considered but ultimately rejected a proposal to publish warnings to husbands. The idea was to circulate pamphlets advising men to be cautious about marrying young women they didn't know well, to be suspicious if they became ill shortly after marriage, to secure their assets in ways that would prevent a spouse from inheriting everything immediately. The proposal was rejected for several reasons. First, it was seen as insulting to women. The vast majority of women were not murderers, and publishing such warnings would unfairly cast suspicion on all wives. Second, it was impractical. How could you warn men to be suspicious of their wives without destroying the institution of marriage itself? Third, and most pragmatically, authorities feared that publishing such warnings would only serve to remind people about Martha Dilling's case, potentially inspiring even more copycats. So instead, they did what they'd done with Martha's case itself. They tried to make it go away quietly. By 1891, newspaper coverage of poison cases had dropped significantly. Editors had been encouraged, again, some would say pressured, to relegate such stories to back pages, to avoid sensational coverage, to focus on other types of crime. The strategy worked. Public interest waned. The copycat plague, while it didn't end completely, became less frequent. But the damage had been done. Martha Dilling had proven something that authorities desperately didn't want proven: that a woman could murder her husband, inherit his property, and get away with it if she was careful enough. That the system had vulnerabilities that could be exploited. That gender expectations, the image of the devoted wife caring for her sick husband, could be weaponized. And there was another effect that Martha's case had, one that's harder to quantify but equally important. It changed how people thought about women's violence. Before Martha Dilling, there was a widespread belief that women were naturally gentler, less capable of cold-blooded, premeditated murder than men. Women who killed typically did so in passion, in self-defense, in moments of rage or desperation. Martha Dilling demonstrated that women could be just as calculating, just as ruthless, just as devoid of empathy as male psychopaths. This was deeply unsettling to Victorian sensibilities. It challenged fundamental assumptions about gender and morality, and it forced a cultural reckoning with the fact that evil could exist in anyone, regardless of sex. But while Martha's case was being deliberately forgotten by the authorities, something else was happening. Folk memory was preserving it in a different way. In the mountains of Appalachia, stories about Martha Dilling began to circulate. Whispered stories, cautionary tales, legends. Some of these stories were reasonably accurate. Others were wildly exaggerated. In some versions, Martha had killed 12 men. In others, she'd been a witch who used black magic rather than poison. In still others, she was a victim herself, framed by rivals or driven to murder by abuse. The truth didn't matter as much as the function these stories served. They were warnings. To young women, this is what happens when ambition becomes monstrous. To men, be careful who you trust. To communities, evil can hide behind a pretty face and a sweet smile. I've spent considerable time in Burke County collecting these oral histories, interviewing descendants of people who lived through the Martha Dilling era, recording the stories that were passed down through generations. And what's fascinating is how the stories changed over time, adapted to reflect the concerns of each era. In the 1920s and 30s, during Prohibition, Martha's story was told as a warning about women's independence, about what happened when women had too much freedom, too much education, too much ambition. She became a symbol of the dangers of modernity. In the 1950s and 60s, the stories emphasized her manipulation of men. She was the ultimate femme fatale, the Black Widow, the woman who used her sexuality as a weapon. This reflected post-war anxieties about changing gender roles. By the 1980s and 90s, some versions of the story had begun to cast Martha as a victim of patriarchal society, a woman driven to violence because she had no other options for escaping poverty and oppression. This reflected changing feminist consciousness and a tendency to re-examine historical female criminals through a more sympathetic lens. But all of these interpretations miss something crucial about Martha Dilling. She wasn't a victim. She wasn't driven to violence by desperation or oppression. She wasn't mentally ill in any traditional sense. She was a psychopath who happened to be born into circumstances that limited her opportunities, and she found a way to exploit the system using the one advantage she had: people's tendency to trust and underestimate young women. Martha Dilling was a predator. Understanding her requires setting aside our desire to find mitigating circumstances, to explain away her actions, to make her fit into comfortable narratives about why people kill. Sometimes people kill because they want something and they're willing to do whatever it takes to get it. Sometimes people kill because they can. That's the uncomfortable truth about Martha Dilling. In 1923, 35 years after Martha's execution, a journalist named Howard Grimes tried to write a comprehensive account of her case for True Detective magazine. He petitioned the Burke County Court for access to the sealed records. He interviewed surviving witnesses. He attempted to piece together the full story. His request to access the records was denied. When he persisted, he was warned that publishing details about Martha's methods could still inspire imitators. When he published his article anyway, using only publicly available information, he received threatening letters from officials in North Carolina suggesting that he drop the matter. Grimes did write a second article, but it was rejected by multiple magazines. He eventually gave up. His research notes, which I tracked down in the archives of the University of North Carolina, show that he discovered several additional suspicious deaths connected to Martha that hadn't been investigated at the time, but without access to the sealed records, he couldn't prove anything. The seal on Martha Dilling's case records was officially lifted in 1988, exactly 100 years after her execution. By then, everyone who'd been directly involved was long dead. The victims' families were gone. The prosecutors, the judges, the witnesses, all gone. It was deemed safe to allow historians and researchers access to the documents. That's when the true extent of Martha's planning and the depth of her psychopathy became fully known. The journal, the letters, the trial transcripts revealing her testimony. All of it had been locked away for a century, and when researchers finally saw it, they realized Martha Dilling was far more than just a poisoner who killed 3 men. She was something much rarer and more disturbing. Modern criminal psychologists who've reviewed Martha's case file have identified her as one of the earliest documented female psychopaths in American criminal history. Not sociopath. The terms are often confused, but there are important distinctions. Sociopaths develop their lack of empathy through environmental factors, trauma, abuse. Psychopaths are born with fundamental differences in brain structure that prevent them from experiencing empathy or emotional connection. Martha showed all the classic signs: superficial charm, pathological lying, manipulation, lack of remorse, failure to accept responsibility, a parasitic lifestyle, using others for personal gain, criminal versatility, and, most tellingly, a complete inability to form genuine emotional bonds with other human beings. The journal entries make this clear. Martha never writes about loving anyone. She never expresses missing her victims. She never shows any genuine emotion except frustration when things don't go according to plan. The few times she writes about feelings, it's obvious she's describing what she thinks she should feel, not what she actually feels. She's mimicking emotions she's observed in others but doesn't understand. One entry from April 1887 is particularly revealing. "I made myself cry today when the neighbor woman came to visit. It is not difficult. I think about cutting onions and my eyes water. She hugged me and said she knows how much I must miss William. I told her I do." She seemed satisfied with this response. People are very easy to convince if you tell them what they want to hear. Martha understood emotions intellectually. She studied them the way a scientist studies specimens. She learned to replicate them convincingly, but she never felt them. And this gave her an enormous advantage when it came to manipulation. She could fake grief without actually grieving. She could pretend to love without the vulnerability that real love creates. She could plan murders without the guilt and fear that would paralyze a normal person. In modern terminology, Martha Dilling was a high-functioning psychopath. If she'd been born in a different era with different opportunities, she might have become a successful businesswoman, a politician, a CEO. She had intelligence, ambition, strategic thinking, and an ability to read and manipulate people. But she was born a poor woman in rural Appalachia in the 1860s, where her options were severely limited. So she used the only tools available to her: marriage and murder. The question that haunts everyone who studies Martha's cases: when did she become what she